No audio. Damn it, damn it, damn it. Let's start again. Okay. Where were we? Okay, my fault. I had the microphone turned down. My apologies. Okay, starting again. Let me know if it's all good this time. Take two. So last time I was working on this, we had converted this form over to like an Ajax form with a view component and stuff. So what I wanted to show was a couple of little polish tweaks that I've made between the last stream and this one, as well as some more interesting changes that I made. So the way this is set up now, I added it so that the button is disabled whenever it doesn't detect any new changes. So if we change this to like a new title, you'll see like the button activates. And then as soon as we save, we get a little check mark, changes are saved, which is helpful. And that sticks around like forever. So you can always look down and see, oh yeah, my most recent changes were saved, until you change anything again. Then it fades out and comes back to, being savable sort of thing, which is cool. Something that I realized, I don't know if I mentioned it on the last stream, but I realized it around that time, was that the validation rules for a published product and an unpublished product are different. So right now this product is published. If we make this unpublished, I can make there be no price, for example, and that's fine, right? Because the product isn't live yet, so you're not required to fill out every single field. You can kind of build it as you go, and then once it's ready, you can publish it. So now if we go up here, we can see we can't publish it because there's no price. But as soon as I add a price and save it, now it is possible to publish it, which is cool. I'm going to show how this kind of works too, the communication between these two components. That'd be kind of interesting. Yeah, so that was kind of like the main thing that I ran into. So what I've done now is I've implemented everything I need to do to kind of handle that on the client side, but I haven't done anything on the server to prevent you from trying to update a published product and have that have different validation rules than when the product is in draft mode. So that's something that I wanted to look at actually implementing today. But before that, I do want to walk through a couple more little things that I did here. So one of the things that's tricky about validation is I like to do as much stuff on the client side as possible, especially because I've been really trying to go out of my way to take advantage of the HTML5 form validation stuff, especially for simple cases. So like, for example, the product title is required, right? So I just get this thing from Chrome, which is nice, by just adding a required attribute to that field. Same with this thing. This is required to be numeric, so I can't type letters. It just doesn't let me. If I type like -1 and I give this a thing, I'm going to say value must be greater than or equal to 1. And this is just built into the browser. And this is supported in all kind of mainstream browsers now. Safari was kind of the biggest problem for the longest time, but now everything's working there too. So I'm trying to do my best to defer having to like hand roll some fancy front-end validation stuff by trying to leverage the HTML5 form validation stuff as much as I can. But I have noticed there's a couple situations where it gets tricky. So down here, for example, this has to be like a valid hex color, right? So this you can implement using the HTML5 validation rule like pattern thing. So here I'm just saying like it has to be valid hex values all lowercase, and it has to be exactly 6 of them. So I get that kind of working for me. But I also wanted to prevent people from like just entering data that was incorrect, right? Like I feel like a good strategy for avoiding complex validation scenarios is to just prevent people from inputting invalid data in the first place. That's the way like this number thing works. I can't type letters here. I can only type numbers. I'm like smashing the keyboard and won't let me do it. So what I did is I built a custom input mask component with Vue. So as soon as I try to type a letter that's not a valid hex code letter, like say P, what happens is it actually converts it to the initial pound sign. If I try to type P again, I get nothing. If I try to type like a valid hex code, like say 4, it adds the hash bang sign for me and then inputs 4. Or I can type the pound sign and that works too. The way that this works is really complicated. I'm not going to be able to show it on the stream, but it's kind of a neat concept of being able to avoid complex validation scenarios by just making sure the user can only enter valid stuff. So if I just like mash on my keyboard, it'll only ever let valid stuff go in, and it stops after 6 characters, which is nice. So I can save that and that'll be all fine. So anyway, something that I wanted to talk about that was kind of interesting because this wasn't in place before was the way that I'm able to communicate between these two components. So you can see like this is publishable right now, right? But if I get rid of the price and save that, now this is not publishable, and I didn't have any refresh or anything. So a lot of the time you'll see people try and do this with like events, and I am technically doing this with events, but the way that it kind of works is kind of neat. So if you look at my edit product blade template now, the way I have this set up is I have a top level component here called edit product page, which is a view component. And I seed this using the JSON version of my product object that comes back from the server. Inside this view component, I have those other two components. So there's the publish toggle and there's the update product details form. So this is the publish toggle and this is the update product details form. So these are actually both inside of another component, which is this kind of div here called an edit product page. And by seeding that page with the single source of truth product, then I can sync that down. And this is using Vue 2.0, so the way that .sync works is different from Vue 1, if you're used to that. But if you look at like the publish toggle component now, the way that this works when you go to update it is I make a post request to publish products with the product that I'm converting to a published product. Then I emit this event, update product, with the response data that comes back from the server, which is the new details of the product. So I emit that back up to the parent. The parent is listening for those changes, and when it gets that, it replaces this product instance with the one that came from the event, and then passes that back down into the publish toggle component, which re-renders itself with the new version of the product. And the same thing happens with the update product details form. So if we look at the update product details form, whenever you hit save on this thing, it does the same thing. It emits that update product event back to the parent with the data that came back from the server. So that's going to update the product that the sort of top level component that holds on to these two, like the parent component, it updates the parent component's product, which then triggers a re-render of both this form and a re-render of the publish toggle. So this is kind of a cool approach that I've been using to have like a single source of truth for some data when I need to talk between two sibling components. So another approach is to use like a global event bus and just pass events back and forth and come up with a name for that event, and that can work too. But I felt like this was a little bit cleaner and a little bit more encapsulated instead of having global events firing around all over the place. Why did I not use a color picker? I would like to use a color picker, but it's not supported in all browsers as like a regular HTML5 form component yet, and I didn't want to bring in like a library to do it and style that and everything. So to start, I'm just using just hex code. But I do want to switch to a real color picker eventually. Here's a good example of a color picker that I like. My buddy Steve has this hero patterns site, and we used some library and Vue to build like these color pickers. I'd like to do something like this, but maybe customize how this looks a little bit to fit with the KiteTail aesthetic a little bit more. But there's a good example of a cool custom color picker. So anyways, all that stuff is sort of working, and I'm pretty happy with how it's all set up. So what I'd like to look at today is basically we have this problem right now where even though I've prevented it on the client side, so like if I make this published, I can't not have a price, for example. That's like kind of conditionally required. And you can see that the way that works is in the update product details form. If we look for the price, all I'm doing here is I have a required attribute that's dynamically bound to whether or not the product is published. So whenever we have a product that's published, this is required. When the product is not published, this is not required. But we have nothing on the server preventing someone from just like maliciously using Postman or something to send a request through to change that. So even though I'm doing all this client-side validation, and that is enough as far as I'm concerned in terms of like providing a good user experience, we still need to protect against it on the server side, even if we don't translate those errors into nicely rendered errors here, because technically no one using the system properly should actually ever get a validation error back from the server because the request should never get sent. but we do still need to protect against it on the server because we don't want anyone kind of corrupting our data. So let's look at some code. So if we look at the product's controller's update action, you can see that this is how this kind of works right now. We get the product from the user. We try to validate the request with a bunch of rules, and then we update it, right? So we have this problem where this set of validation rules is only correct for draft products. If a product is published, well, then all of a sudden price becomes required. I think that's kind of the only really important one to be concerned about. So let's start by writing a test that proves that price is required if a product is published. Let's go to our update product test, and you can see I have this price is optional test, right? So this tests that a price is optional when a product is in draft mode. So let's rename this to price is optional when the product is not published. Let's run this, see that it passes, and let's look. I have a product factory class, which is like a nice little convenient wrapper around Laravel's factory stuff, so that I can do slightly more complex stuff when needed. So we have a create publishable, create published. I think what we're going to do is create an unpublished state so that we can be explicit about it in our tests. So let's look at our model factory here, and if we look for publishable, so you can see I have product, I have a publishable product, and that's kind of it. So let's explicitly make a unpublished product. So we set this as published by setting this published at timestamp. So let's copy. Do we need to really set the connected account and stuff? I don't think we actually do in this case. So let's just duplicate this one, and we'll keep it at the top, I think. So we'll have like unpublished, publishable, so it's in a state where it could be published, and then we'll have one that is published. So we'll call this unpublished, and it won't use the publishable state. And we'll pass through the attributes, but we're going to array merge default set of attributes with that, which is going to specifically set the published at column to null. Just so that when we look at our factory, we can see, okay, well, an unpublished product is a product where published at is null. That's how we kind of know that it's unpublished. Let's go back to our test, and where we're saying price is optional when a product is not published. What we'll do here is we'll create instead of using this factory call, we'll use product factory, and we'll call the create unpublished method. And for some reason, my global imports haven't been working with the Sublime PHP companion thing anymore, which is kind of annoying. So I have to go manually import that. I'll have to report that as a bug, maybe. Okay. Let's just make sure this is still passing as expected, and it is. We can get rid of this here. So let's add another test here that says price is required when the product is published. So we'll create a published product, and we'll give it an old price, and we'll try to set it to empty. And then here, instead of asserting null on the fresh price, let's assert that the fresh price is still 100. So basically assert that it is unchanged. So we get an error, failed asserting that null matches expected 100. So it allowed us to update the price even though we didn't want to be able to. So obviously, like, one way that we could solve this problem would be to do something really boring, like, let me think actually if there's even a way to do this. So I guess like what you would do like one way to solve this is to just say product is published. If the product is published, then we want price to be required. Otherwise, we want price to be nullable. And we have to use nullable here because we're also using numeric. So this should, in theory, get it working, right? And it doesn't, so we got a 302. Oh, that's fine. Except I don't think we should be getting a 302 anymore, because the way that we're updating is I'm surprised that that's giving us a 302. Let's dump this response for a second, because you can see that I've changed this to return the updated product, not to return a redirect anymore. Oh, no, sorry. The redirect is because of validation errors. So I don't want to actually assert that we get a 302. What I want to do is I want to assert. So I have a bunch of old stuff here where we're asserting that the session has errors because we're making a patch request that's not a JSON patch request. So I'm going to have to update all these because we've changed it to be JSON style now. Let's look at our base test case for a second, because I feel like I added a helper for this. Assert JSON has errors. So where did I call that? So I'm calling that in purchasing products test. But I haven't updated the update products test to make use of that yet. So let's just do a write on this one. And then I can look at updating the other ones at some point. So instead of doing a regular patch, we want to do a patch JSON. And I'm pretty sure that this is going to be like, nope, you don't get a 302 now. Yeah, so we get a 422, which is kind of what I expected. So let's make use of this assert JSON has errors thing. So I think the easiest way to do that is just to say response assert JSON has errors. And then you can pass in an array here, the way I have it set up. So we could say an array of errors, like where price is 1 and maybe there's other ones. But if you just have 1, you can just pass in just the value on its own. Because what I'm doing here is, the way that this works is I first check to make sure that the JSON on the response has an errors key. So if it doesn't have an errors key, then we know like we didn't get JSON errors back at all. So we want to fail early there. But if we do have errors, then I use array wrap, which is a Laravel helper function. Oh, there's a test for it. This is actually just as nice to look at. So here's a string, here's an array, here's an object, here's a value. If we try to wrap the string, it gives us the string in an array. If you try to wrap an array, it just gives you the array because it's already in an array. It's basically saying like take some individual item and put it in an array unless it's already an array. It's kind of helpful for situations like this. So then it's just going to loop over all of the potential keys that we're looking for errors in and make sure that the JSON errors array has that key. So let's check this. Okay, so this is passing. So this is one way we could solve this problem. I think this way is disgusting. I've never seen anything more horrifying in my life. So what I think I want to try, and we'll treat this as a refactoring step, but because of the fact that the validation rules are different on whether or not the product is published or whether it's unpublished, I think, to me, that's a sign that the right place to put the validation rules is in the product class. So instead of having to ask the product class about its state and then decide what validation errors to use, I just want to ask the product for the validation rules that I should use. Instead of having to interrogate it and be like, oh, you're published? Okay, well then I should use these validation rules. Oh, you're not published? I should use these. I just want to say, hey product, what are your validation rules? I don't care if you're published or if you're not published. That's of no concern to me. I just want the damn rules that I should use. And that's kind of like a general object-oriented thing that you should be looking to do. Look for opportunities to kind of relentlessly use polymorphism to remove conditional logic from your code, or at least from the consuming code. So let's look at our product class, and where should we put this? Maybe under near to array, seems fine. So I'm going to add a method on the product itself, non-does beware, called validation rules. And I'm going to take this code and I'm going to return that from here. And this becomes this. And we're going to have to import the valid hex color, and we're going to have to import rule. Illuminates. I think that's the right one. Yeah. So now if we go back here and we say validate the request against the product's validation rules, and we're still green. And when you look, the whole thing should be green. Cool. David asks, why are you not using custom requests? I could use custom requests. I honestly never use form requests in my apps at all. I just don't really like the feature that much. It always felt kind of weird to me to have to basically type in what request I want to use in the controller, which is later in the request cycle than the actual rules happen. I just found it kind of confusing and didn't really make sense to me how it worked. I would rather validate directly in the controller or create like a form object or something. It's just my style. Yeah, just not a huge fan of them. It wouldn't really make a difference in this situation either, because it's just a different place where you put this conditional logic. So this is fine. I kind of like this better in the sense that we've moved the rules to the product, so the controller is simpler and it doesn't have to understand that there's a difference between published validation rules and unpublished validation rules. But I still don't really like this ternary thing here. Like, this is kind of sloppy. I think I would honestly rather duplicate this whole thing almost than have it done this way. So I think what I would be tempted to do is something like this. If this is published, you know, this would be one way to do it, right? Else return that. This should still pass, even though we're just duplicating that published check. So that's still green. But now here, I don't have to check that at all. We can just say this is required, the end. And then down here, we can just say, like, this is nullable, the end. Oh, that's not a test. This is a test. So that works. But it is kind of grim that we duplicate the entire thing, right? So I'm trying to think if there's like a clever way that we could solve this with like array merge. So say we had two methods. Say we have like a private method here called unpublished validation rules. And then we have one called published validation rules. And then we had another one called like base validation rules or something. So we could refactor this to move this down into like base validation rules. And I'd be tempted to just like get rid of that. Actually, you know what? This is what I think I would do. I think I would take the unpublished ones and put those here. And I would just treat the published ones as like a superset of that. So for published validation rules, we could return like array merge this unpublished validation rules, and then merge that with these validation rules. And then up here, we could at least just say, if this is published, return this published validation rules. Otherwise, return unpublished validation rules. So all this does is basically override the price entry. And it's kind of crappy that we have to like duplicate numeric and min1. Like, we could probably come up with a way to avoid that if we wanted to. But I'm not that concerned about it. And honestly, like, I probably wouldn't change this from the original ternary one inside this validation rules method either. But I thought it would be useful to kind of like explore what it could look like to separate them out. It makes this kind of nice. Like, if it's published, like, you can tell immediately that like the reason that this might return a different value is whether or not it's published. Whereas before, it was just a big array and there was a ternary kind of hiding in there, and you had to kind of look for it and figure out what the different situations were. So I actually think I'm okay with this solution. So that's green. And that's green. So I think what I want to look at now maybe is just updating the rest of these tests to not be dealing with redirects and sessions anymore, since we're updating products with Ajax. So just start at the top. So we have updating a product. This should return a 200 if it's updated, which is fine. And yep, that one's good. Requires authentication. So this shouldn't return a redirect. Let's change this to a JSON. And we should actually just get a status 401. So this might work already. Yeah, and it does. As soon as we change the request to have that JSON content type, then we're good. So I think the other thing that I want to change here is the way that we're doing this. I don't think there's a lot of benefit to like refinding it. I think the way that I've been doing this lately that I prefer is just to like fresh the whole product, since we already have a reference to it. Okay, so let's change this one to patch JSON too. So this one is asserting the session has errors. So I think we can just change this to assert JSON has errors. And that's still good. And then we can update this again to just be a call to product fresh. And hopefully we're still good. Okay, price is optional when the product is not published. Let's change this. Let's rename these a little bit too. Since name is required whether or not it's published or unpublished, let's call it name is always required. Price is optional when the product is not published. Price is required when the product is published. Price must always be numeric. So let's do a JSON request here. Instead of asserting against the session, we'll assert that the JSON has errors, and we'll use product fresh here as well. And we're green. Why not make a variable for the rules for price inside the first minute? Yeah, you could do that. I don't like variables. It feels so stupid to say it, but I actually do kind of avoid them. I try to think of, I really like functional programming, and I like thinking about the code that I'm writing as like acts of transformation on things. And when you start having like variables that are kind of like backing up state so you can do other stuff, it's not really like a pure transformation anymore. It's sort of like a hand wavy thing, but there's something just like feels so clean and pure to me about being able to take like some input and like transform that into some output, like a series of like discrete steps, instead of having to like back up variables and state and change things. That's why I like the collection programming stuff so much, and why I find that so fun. Okay, priced must always be at least $1. Doesn't depend on whether or not it's published or unpublished. So I'll make a JSON patch request here. We'll assert that the JSON has errors, and we'll update this to be a fresh product. Green. Description is always optional. So whether or not it's published, it doesn't really matter. We can always change it. So that should be passing already, and it is. Banner image is only replaced if provided. This is interesting in that I plan to completely change how this works, probably on Friday's stream. So I'm not going to think about that one too much, although I will change this to be a fresh call. Same with like banner image must be an image. Again, that's no big deal. Banner images must be, yeah, these are banner image validation rules. So theme color is always optional. So we'll create a product and we'll make a patch request. Now, one thing that we're not doing, which is kind of interesting, is we're changing these names to say like theme color is always optional, right? But we're not testing that against both a published product and an unpublished product. And that's an interesting thing to think about. Like, should we be creating a published product and testing to make sure theme color is optional, and creating an unpublished product and testing to make sure theme color is optional? Like, do we really see value in testing both of those paths? And I'm inclined to say that I don't care that much. It just seems like a mistake that I'm unlikely to make, but it does seem possible that we could make that mistake. Like, for example, say we have, what's a good example in here? The name is always required one, maybe. So say we made this mistake in the product class where we screwed up this array merge somehow, and we actually like just returned this. Now, technically we have a bug in our code because name is not required if the product is published now, but we don't have a test for published products saying that the name is required. So it is kind of a tricky situation to decide, like, do we really care about testing both of those paths? And I'm not sure. Not sure if I would do it. It'd slow things down a lot to have double the amount of tests, and they're not super fast tests because they're feature tests. So I think I would be pretty happy to say that it's just not that big of a risk. Like, we'd sort of have to go out of our way to break that. But it is interesting to think about nonetheless. All right, so theme color is always optional. So we've updated that to be a JSON. This should be fine. Theme color can omit the leading hash. I think I don't think always is really appropriate here. I don't know, like whatever. I think it's fine to leave that without always. Theme color must be a valid hex color. Let's say must always be a valid hex color, whatever. Theme color can always omit leading slash. Might as well be consistent, I guess, except for in the banner image ones, which I'm planning to delete or change. Okay, so let's assert that the JSON has errors. Theme color. And we got to change this to a patch JSON. Okay. Cool. The interesting thing about the coverage stuff is that if we did run a code coverage report, it wouldn't go down because the code still executes. So the way that like PHP units code coverage stuff works is that all it checks is it looks to see if there's any lines in your code that didn't run during your test suite. So all of this would still run during our test suite, but there are situations that are not tested that we could potentially break. So it's an interesting example of how code coverage can be misleading. It would be interesting to actually run a code coverage report sometime on a stream to kind of walk through that and talk about it a little bit. I do not have Xdebug installed locally, which I need to run code coverage. So I'll have to figure that out sometime. Yeah. Okay, so let's run the suite and see what things are looking like. What was the PHP unit single test running thing? Yeah, that is that link that Randy posted there. I have a Sublime PHP unit plugin that I originally wrote, and it's kind of borrowed from a Ruby one that I saw someone write about a long time ago. And then David Hemphill has added a couple useful features to it too. So that's a bunch of stuff done, but it's not really, Normally I would go for another 20 minutes. And I'm trying to decide if there's anything that we can get into that would be interesting that we can get done in less than that much time. Or if we can call this a short one. I can say that what I'm looking forward to doing on the next stream, I don't think I want to get into it this time. I think we'll keep this as a shorter one. What I want to do on the next stream is if you look at my update product details form view component, which represents this form here, the way this currently works is we send one big request to the server with all the details and the new image file. What I would like to do what I don't like about this, honestly, is that I can't send this as JSON. I have to send this as like a multi-part form data sort of gross thing. I would like to be able to send this through as real JSON instead of like form data. But because you can't send files in JSON, I would have to come up with a different solution. So something that I've been wanting to try, and that I think will be a good solution, but I have yet to implement, is I want to change things so that when I upload an image here, it immediately makes a request to the server, uploads the image, and the server returns like a reference to where that image is stored. And then when I make the request to save the image, I just want to pass through the new path to the image instead of actually passing through the file. And then I can pass it through as real JSON. That has another interesting benefit, I think, which is that it's going to simplify this controller. So this is actually like pretty simple already. Like I get the file from the request, and then I store that file in the images folder in my public disk. And Laravel makes this like pretty clean. But it would be cool to handle all the file upload stuff in like a separate controller that's just dealing with file stuff, and then this just gets a string. And then maybe I have a custom validation rule that validates that that string points to a real image file that actually exists, which could be cool. Yeah, you could convert the image to base64 and submit that whole thing. That's like a whole other can of worms, I think, because then we have to decide, do we just store the image as base64 in the database, or do we take that base64 and decode it and save the raw file to the disk somewhere? I don't know. It's kind of tricky to figure out the best way to handle that. So I think I'd rather just deal with like boring ass files. But yeah, should be interesting. Maybe something that we can look at while we're on this stream, since we have a little bit more time left over than normal, is I'll show you how some of the kind of more interesting things here work. Because you might have looked at this and thought, what is this null file thing? Or what is this optional sanitize thing? So, null file. So with Laravel's file helper on the request, you can ask for like a default value, right? If we look at file, illuminate, interacts with input. So we ask for a key, otherwise it returns like some default value. So what I decided is I didn't want to have to check if the file was actually present before storing it. So I created this null object called a null file that implements store but just straight up does nothing. So it actually returns null from store, right? So when you try to call store on a null file, you get null back as the path, whereas on a real file, you get like the actual stored path back. So I don't have to write any conditional logic here, which is nice. So I can update the image path whether or not the image is provided, and it just totally works. So that's kind of a cool little trick. And the other thing is this optional helper and then this sanitize thing. So a lot of time I run into situations where I have data come in from the user and I want to normalize it in some way. So an example might be, say you want to like strip white space from the beginning or end of something. Laravel does that for you automatically now, but that's something you might have needed to do manually in the past. Or maybe you want to convert something to all lowercase letters. Or maybe have like a phone number come in and it's like in this format, you know, 555, 555, 5555. And some people might pass it in like that. Some people might pass it in like this. Some people might just use spaces for the whole thing. Some people might use dots, whatever. So you might want to like normalize all this into a single format, where maybe you just want to store straight up the 10 digits in the database so that you can format it the way you want, right? So sanitizing that data is something that I need to do fairly often. So if you look at my app service provider, and I'm going to run my test to make sure that all this mucking around hasn't busted anything. Okay, if you look at app service provider, I've got a sanitize macro that just takes a callback, which could also be a function name, and runs that callback against that particular item in the request. So normally, if I wanted to like, just say I want to like convert the description to all lowercase, I could just say request sanitize description, and then I could say stir to lower, and that would lowercase the description every single time. Alternatively, you could pass a whole closure, right? So I could say like value, and then I could say return stir to lower value. And that's the same thing because that string acts as a callable. So that's kind of cool. But I also had situations where sometimes I had data that was optional, right? Like theme color could possibly be null. And if it's null, I don't want to run it through my sanitize function. Because if I pass null into like stir replace, things are just going to like blow up. So what I did is I added another helper to the request called optional. And this is what this looks like. It returns a new instance of this class I called optional request parameter. And it just passes in the value from the request at that specific key. So the only thing optional request parameter does is implement my sanitize method. So you can see here I'm getting an optional request parameter back when I call request optional, and then I'm calling sanitize, right? And all optional request parameter does is basically encapsulate that conditional logic of whether or not to actually run this callback. So you can see here, if the value is null, the value that this was constructed with, if it's null, just return null. Don't even try to run the sanitize callback because it'll blow up. But if there is a value, then we do want to sanitize that value with that callback. So that just lets me write less conditional code in my controllers by using patterns like the null object pattern or this optional request parameter thing, which just like encapsulates that kind of like conditional logic, choosing which path to go down. So I thought that was kind of cool. This is kind of gross. We can hopefully eliminate this one day, but basically what this is saying, if the image path is null, just exclude it before updating the product. And that's where that one test came from. If you look at update product test, that says banner images only replaced if provided. So if there's a banner image key gets passed through and the value is null, it doesn't actually delete the old image. It just doesn't do anything, which was just kind of a special case just for images. So that is something that we're going to be able to simplify when we switch to uploading and editing as different steps, because whenever I make a patch request to update the product, I can just pass through the old banner image path every single time since I'll still have it. So that's another little improvement that I'm looking forward to using to simplify that a little bit. Anyways, I think I'm going to wrap it up for today. A little bit shorter than normal, but hopefully this was kind of like an interesting idea, this idea of like pushing validation rules into the model if the validation rules are conditional based on some information that only the product knows about. And hopefully you learned a trick or two with some of the interesting stuff that I'm doing here. And maybe the stuff related to the parent components and the communication and the view stuff was cool too. So I guess we did cover a lot of interesting things here in a relatively short stream, like 45 minutes. But anyways, I'll hopefully see you on Friday if you're around for the next one, where I think we're going to work on this separating the file upload from the kind of data editing thing, which I'm actually really excited about. So thanks for checking out the stream, and hope to see you on Friday.